Good evening, everyone. I'm Marsha, and I'm the founder and one of the members of the Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival. We are a not for profit organization that was started 4 years ago, and we're here specifically to amplify the voices of the Caribbean and Caribbean literature in North America, where the Caribbean diaspora is very strong. We do that with an evolving year-long set of programming, including 2 podcasts and events and talks like this. And one of the partnerships that we hold closest to our heart is this one here with the Center for Fiction. Through our co-presented events and their support of our ongoing annual festival, we are able to shine the light on Caribbean stories in the way that our writers deserve. It's a very fertile region brimming with stories, with themes much like Charmaine's book tonight that speak to the universal human condition. And so we are honored again to be the co-presenter for tonight's event, and we wish Charmaine all the best with this phenomenal sweeping story. Thanks for the opportunity again, Melanie and our friends at the Center for Fiction.
Thank you, Marsha. All right, a few housekeeping items before we get started this evening. Let's see, we will have an audience Q&A, so please click where it says Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type your questions in there rather than putting them in the chat. That way they're all gathered together in one place. But please do use the chat, as some of you already are, to let us know where you're logging in from and to respond, react to anything that's said this evening. It's a very warm crowd already, so I'm happy to welcome you here. I feel like if we were in the same room, you would be saying something back to me, so welcome. Okay, now to the main event. Let me introduce our guest. Charmaine Wilkerson is an American writer who has lived in Jamaica and is based in Italy. A graduate of Barnard College and Stanford University, she is a former journalist whose award-winning short fiction has appeared in various magazines and anthologies. Black Cake is her first novel. Joining her in conversation this evening is Taylor Jenkins Reid. Taylor is the New York Times bestselling author of 7 novels, including Malibu Rising, Daisy Jones and the Six, The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and their daughter, and welcome to you both.
Hello. Thank you guys for having us. Hi, Charmaine.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm very excited to get to talk to you about this fabulous book. And I've got some hard-hitting questions for you. I've got some easier ones, but in general, I just really love this book and I want to tell everybody about it. So let's get started. How are you feeling? The book just came out. You're a Read with Jenna pick. It's got to be a big week. How are you so far?
Well, it's really exciting. You know, you spend so much time writing on your own. And so that moment when you have an opportunity to share what you've written with other people is very exciting. Everything that's going on around it is just, for me, a sort of affirmation of the fact that the story is reaching people. So we'll see where it goes from there. You know, you have more experience. You've written 7 novels. You're my role model.
Well, let me start this conversation about the book with the really important stuff, which is, what is Black Cake and how can I get my hands on one?
Well, we can discuss that in a moment.
Right.
But there are lots of places. A lot of people, fortunately, have this habit of making black cake in their homes. And I realized recently that I wouldn't even know where to get it. I had to actually do the research because I'm used to having it made by someone in the family. So black cake is essentially a traditional Caribbean fruit cake. And it's sort of an evolved version of what would have been an English plum pudding way back when. And what happened between the plum pudding and the Caribbean fruitcake involves just a lot of influence, not only agriculture, not only the ingredients, which are different, rum, dark brown cane sugar, but also the economic and political changes that took place between that moment on one side of the world and today, where we have this wonderful dessert that represents, joy and celebration and has a wonderful flavor, but is also a symbol of many things that have happened to people through colonialism, through forced labor, through indentured labor, and then ultimately through a sort of a claiming of this tradition as one's own, meaning you now have this dessert, as I said, that's just considered the end-all be-all, the quintessential Caribbean cake. But in the novel Black Cake, it really sort of represents all of those things that I've mentioned to you.
Well, you've done a beautiful job of, Black Cake is such a rich metaphor for so many of the things that you talk about in the novel. So I want to talk about the story that you have centered around this cake. So the New York Times described it as it's a story of a brother and sister who learn the truth about their mother only when it is too late to ask questions. Now they have to figure out how, when, and with whom to carry out her last wish. So without giving away just how complicated that request becomes, tell us a little bit about Benny and Byron and Eleanor and this request. And if you would also, how this story came to you that you've centered around this cake.
So Byron and Benny are a brother and sister born and raised in California, once inseparable, only there's been a huge rift in their family and they're not talking to one another. Then their mother dies and they're forced to come together for the first time in years to deal with her passing, but also to understand why she has left them a puzzling inheritance. And that is a small black cake sitting in her freezer. And she specifies that they are to sit down and share the cake when the time is right. So what does that mean? And she's also left a long voice recording, hours and hours of sort of a one-sided conversation on a USB pen drive in which she shares the story of her life and the stories of other people. And it's going to take them a while to figure out what she's talking about, who's who, what this means for them. By the time they reach the end of the story, their lives will have changed, and they will also be looking at not only their mother differently, but their own identities and their own sense of how they should be living their lives and who they are. And so you ask how that came about. I really have a way of writing in which I wrote the story in different pieces. I was writing the story about these teenage girls on the cusp of womanhood in the 1960s in the Caribbean who were obsessed with the sea. And that's where I feel a connection with your own most recent book, Taylor, Malibu Rising. These girls were so physically strong and so single-minded about what they wanted to do that they're different from other girls of their times, and they're running up against the expectations of others of how they should be living their lives. It's going to create difficulty and it's going to change their lives. Their destinies will be affected directly by this obsession with the sea. So the black cake didn't come in until much later. You know, I was writing a series of scenes, realized at some point that I was writing a novel, and then the black cake just sort of walked into the story. But I realized at that moment where it had come from. A few years before I knew I was writing a novel, I had, had my mobile phone. I got a text message on my cell phone from a younger member of my family who was asking for my mother's black cake recipe. She made a legendary rum cake. And I was surprised that the request came in and that I hadn't even thought to share the recipe with that person. And so I started thinking about the ways in which we choose to inherit identity and family and culture, what we hold close to our heart. And often it's through food that we inherit the stories that form our identities. And those thoughts were just sort of sitting there. I'd written something down in a journal. And that came back to me as I was writing this story. So you see what I'm telling you, I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to write a story about a cake. It's going to be called Black Cake. There's going to be this story. I had all of these other little ideas that began to build, and I began to discover these characters. Taylor?
That's very interesting, especially because, you know, ultimately what you have is a book that feels very, look, there are many different voices, which we'll talk about, and there's a lot of different places that it comes from, but you've pulled together such a cohesive, strong, clear story that feels, you've done something that I think is sometimes really difficult to do, which is to say, this is a story that feels like you were the only person that could have told it. The story could only have been told this way. And so one of the questions that I have is, you know, this book spans a lot of time and a lot of places in the globe. You're going from the Caribbean, you're in Los Angeles, Scotland, Rome, London. There are so many places that you render so vividly. And so, and they're very transportive. If someone's looking for a book that's going to take them to a different time and place, take them to a lot of different time and places, this is a absolutely wonderful book to get lost in for that purpose. My question for you is, how did you know that these were the places that this story was going to live? Because they feel so organically tied to the land that you're telling them in. So what was that process like for you, finding not just the shape of the story, but specifically where it would live?
So I think because the earliest scenes that I wrote that then led me to connect to other things I'd written, started out in the Caribbean, that logic of the imagination would also follow the logic of real life. If you have people living in the 1960s, on a Caribbean island, specifically one that's tied to the United Kingdom, then it makes sense that people then move to the UK. And then it's also common for people to move to the US. But you know, when you ask me about place, the thing for me about place, and thank you for your comments about rendering these well, the truth is that for me, when I think of writing about place, I think more about the physical experience of being in a place. And so for me, the stories began with water and then a certain kind of climate, and then I understood. And then the other experiences continue to go back to the earth, the water, the plants, and the food, of course, the food. And so when I begin a scene, I'm thinking more of how the person is existing in their physical space. The logic of the imagination took me to specific cities and specific settings. But again, the characters were born of their experiences. The Byron and Benny, children of California, their connections to the water and to their environment and also their culture, which is different from their parents' culture. I'm not sure that I'm really answering your question, except to say, I didn't decide to write a story that was going to go to all of those places. These characters came to me, I began to get to know them, and the logic of their world, which is different from my real world, took them and took me to these places. And of course, then you do research. You know, I like to call it a plausibility check, not really research, but you know, you do research to see, does this make sense? What about that time period, a period of time? What about certain things that I imagine? Would this really be that way? Would work be like that? Would the city be like that? I don't know, is that, I think you tend to think more of what you want to write about or the period you want to write about. Is that correct? It's
Sure.
A little different.
Sure, but I like what you're saying, which is that the story travels to the places that you feel within your heart the characters would naturally gravitate toward. You know, so it's all character based, which is really, really interesting. And you know, the story that you've written is so complex and touches on so many. There are so many themes within a novel, so many issues that it touches on, that you could pull any one of them out and have a really interesting discussion about those things. There's, as you had brought up earlier, that sort of the expectations of young women and bumping up against those expectations and perhaps the limited options available for certain women, and what happens when you accept none of those options, or you certainly brace up against them. The complexity of what makes someone family, or what makes a family. The question which I always am interested in, which is, can we ever really understand the full life of our parents and the people that came before us? And then also you render with beautiful nuance issues of colorism and racism and misogyny and all these things. I want to focus in on one particular, which I will define in 2 words, that this book asks a lot of questions about, and that is legacy and inheritance. If you would talk about the way that those ideas not only shaped this novel, but how you think they shape people's lives, because you've rendered it so well here, that the past informs the present and can affect the future, and how those things are so tied together. So would you talk a little bit about how you came to write about legacy and inheritance the way that you have, and what it means for Benny and Byron and perhaps other people in the novel?
Well, you yourself said the past informs the present, and that's true. We know that. That's just a fact of life. But the thing that fascinates me is the way in which we inherit the past. So what is our legacy? Often that comes to us through stories. And one of the stories that can be passed down from one generation to another, or from one region to another, because we also talk a bit about diaspora, is through food. We pass stories through food, through experiences in kitchens, because food isn't just about sustenance, although sometimes it is, of course, but it's also culture, it's memory. And in the case of Black Cake, for example, it's that hidden story. So going back to the idea of the past informing the present, when we are shaped, I'm fascinated by the ways in which we are shaped by the stories that we're told. So there's kind of the official view of what the world was like before and how we got to where we were. But within a family, how do we shape our identities based on the stories that are told? And how do we shape them based on the stories that are not told? And, we all have had experiences, even if we've been lucky enough to have elders who told us a lot of stories, we've all had experiences where we figure out later on, maybe when we're older or old enough to understand, that things weren't quite the way we were told, or that maybe people didn't know anything about the past. And in fact, contemporary literature, one of the things that I see contemporary literature is doing now is taking a look at the stories we were told and taking a new look at how we look at history. And that can be true then on the individual level, family level, cultural level. I have done a lot of thinking about identity and family and shifting concepts of home. I have moved around quite a bit in my life, probably a bit more than others of my generation, but I come from a family of movers. A lot of us have moved around, and I am the child of people who came from another country. And I come from a multicultural family. So also, if you use the term race, you could also say I come from a multiracial family. So you have all of these influences. And I think about the ways in which we identify based on what we are told about ourselves, and also based on other people's expectations and stereotypes. There's just this constant sort of dynamic. And again, the stories carry weight. What is the story that you were told about who you are? What is the story that Eleanor has told her children, Byron and Benny, about who they are? Well, they understood that their parents were orphans, I can say that much, They understood that their parents came from another country. There were a lot of things they took for granted, and they felt very grounded in their identity as children of their state, their country, their culture. Then their mother tells them a story, and she begins to peel back the layers. And not only do they understand that their identity is not quite what they thought, and certainly their mother isn't who they think she is, but they begin to understand that misunderstandings, disagreements within the family were born of silence or half-truths, or perhaps you could even say the insensitivity of the children to the story of the parents, but what did they know? So I won't give you actual spoilers, you've read the book, but it's all about the power of the story. And I'm fascinated by that. That's always in the back of my mind, the idea of how identities shift and how they go back and forth. And this informed the story. But again, I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to write about these issues. I follow characters, and the characters help me to discover who they are on the page. You know, just as I'm talking to you now, then if we see each other in another year, you might have something new to tell me, and I discover more about you. That's what I find happens when I write a character. I'm curious as to whether that happens with you.
Yeah, I mean, I always think I have an idea of who somebody is when I start, and then I find them saying something or doing something that I didn't quite know they were going to say or do. And I think for me, it's within the first draft that you start to follow the threads and realize there's more to the person than you thought when you were sitting down to write it. If there isn't, by the time you get to the end of the first draft, you're maybe in a bad place. You haven't created depth to it. But you've touched on something here, and you write it so succinctly in the book, when you say sometimes the stories we don't tell about ourselves matter even more than the things that we say, and you've touched on that here. What you've done with the book is you've allowed for a number of different stories to be told through different points of view. And so a lot of times the reader is more aware of the full scope of the stories than the individual characters, which is a really rich way of telling this story. So how did, and I would imagine, again, based on your experiences of writing this book, that it was an organic process, but I'm curious if you could talk about how did you come to the way that you told this story, which is to say from a number of different points of view, and how did which points of view you were going to tell come to you?
Well, I wrote this story initially in scenes. This is typical of how I write, Taylor. I sit down at the computer and I just go. And then I'll look at that and I'll call it Taylor at the supermarket and put that in a file. Then I'll write another thing and it'll be, you know, Joey at the beach, put that in another file. So what happens is that I write what I call scenes, and I don't always know where they're going. So again, Black Cake began as a number of scenes, but I did kind of sense pretty early on that the teenagers with their unusual tendencies, you know, very strong physically, obsession with the sea, sort of disobedient, were going somewhere, that maybe they could be more of a story eventually. First, I wrote a very short story, then I went on. And at a certain point, I suddenly realized that they were connected to people in the present. And that's really how it happened. In terms of writing, you know, in terms of putting it together, this comes naturally to me. It's a bit like my conversation, which is not always a good thing. I'm talking about one thing and then I'm talking about another, but I know what I'm talking about and I've got the whole thing in a wheel in my head. So writing it in that way came naturally. Then you have to get organized. You know, I get my pencil and a notepad and start diagramming so that I can keep track of who's who, what the connections can be, whether I'm off in terms of years and locations, whether it's making sense. But essentially, I reached a certain point in the story when I realized I had one generation and another generation, and I understood that they were connected. I reached a point in the story in which I could see the story sort of like a wheel or a pie chart. And I would just access parts of the story as I wrote. And you will see that in the structure of the story. I don't follow chronological order. I jump back and forth from one person to the other. And I have to say, you know, it's interesting. They always say that a big part of writing is revision. And that's absolutely true, because it's one thing to jump all over the place in a short story that's, you know, 10 pages. It's another thing to go nearly 400 pages and really, you know, keep that going. But I pretty much saw the whole thing. And I actually still have files in my, you know, on my sort of hard drive that I never did use. I still have scenes that I never did use, but they informed me in that logic of the imagination. So I wouldn't say that I decided to do it that way. It comes naturally to me. I should say something, you know, we've got a lot of writers in the audience, I think, and a number of them may be familiar with a very short form of short story called flash fiction. So when I was at the point where I said, you know, I've always wanted to write, I'm always dabbling, now I'm going to spend more time really writing stories, I found that that's what I was doing, short stories, very, very short stories. And I discovered a community of writers who write what's known as flash fiction. And these are stories that are so short that they may only take up a page or two, or even a paragraph or two. And these stories are full-bodied narratives. They have beginnings, middles, and ends, but they're very intense in their gaze. And so I sort of found permission through that kind of writing to keep going. And it's not the first time that I started to write a longer work in this way. So I would say that tends to be my way. Never say never. I may do it differently the next time, but I do tend to put things to, you know, just sort of spit things out there. I get the image and I keep filling it in, you know, sort of like those watercolors that we, what were those things? Were they watercolors or paint by numbers? Is that what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Paint by number.
Yeah.
At a certain point, I see the missing colors or the missing sections. And I don't always accomplish what I need to, but it's there.
I am so fascinated by this because it's just the total opposite of the way that I work, and it seems so much more romantic and artistic and just sort of delicious. Here's my question is, so I know you've written flash fiction, you've written short stories. How, I understand that there were pieces of it that you were working on and that you started to see that the pieces could come together, but there's a difference between seeing that and seeing, oh, I'm going to flesh this out into my debut novel. So how did the form come to you in terms of not just, I can combine some of these elements I've been working on, but I can make this and sustain this for a much larger period of time than what you had previously done?
Well, I think that basic ignorance and inexperience went a long way to helping me, because I just kept going, you know, but seriously, no, really, I was writing and I had written, you've read the book, so I can tell you and still be vague, Benny. Benny, who's the sister, the brother and sister are Byron and Benny is the sister. And there's a scene where she dresses up in an animal costume, and you know what that is. I wrote that very early in the process, and I thought it was a short story of some sort, and it was just sitting there, and all of a sudden one day I went, Benny, and that's how it happens. I discovered that. So I did not say, oh, this is going to be my debut novel. But once I saw the connection between the generations, and once I understood that, as you know, there's a mystery involved as well, I just sort of kept going. And you know, in the revision, then I really had to take a hard look at how you sustain a lot of short scenes over 400 pages.
Mhm.
And you know, another thing that's wonderful is when you have the privilege of actually having someone who says they will publish your work, you discover this whole other world, which I discovered, of people who would sort of sit with me and talk with me about the scenes and the characters to help me to fine tune them. You know,
Mhm.
they said, we love this, it's great. Okay, let's see if we can polish, you know. So I gave them a silver teapot and
Yeah.
they helped me to polish it.
I'm curious, especially for the writers in the room, and again, the way that you're describing piecing this all together is very fascinating to me because it's so foreign to me. And so I find myself asking, when you are seeing these different pieces, what is guiding you toward an understanding of pulling them together? So for instance, you could say just instinctually on a gut level, there's something speaking to me. You could say, I just feel so passionate about this one and passionate about this one that I feel like they could go together. So is it instinct? Is it passion? Is it perhaps like a curiosity that something happens and you think, oh, I want to know more? What is it that what you're describing feels a little bit like you're in a cave and you have a flashlight and you can only see so far ahead of you. And so I'm sort of curious, like what's drawing you further into the cave?
Well, so you mentioned three different things, and I would say the first and the second. So there's instinct. I tend to write organically. I'm triggered. When I say I'm triggered, scenes are triggered by very specific things in my mind. Something I see, something I smell, something I hear, an idea, something I saw on the news, but it's very specific. And that's how I get to writing. But at a certain point, the story really does take over. And you talked about holding the flashlight in the cave and looking around. That's it. You begin to explore. It really is like I think it's more like walking into a community, not so much walking into a cave.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like you see a person, you see another, and you begin to see the connection. At a certain point, I mentioned how the cake came into the story.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a sort of an aha moment because I understood that the kinds of thoughts which were personal and real life, which I'd connected to that black cake recipe, were the kinds of thoughts that were sort of under there. You know, stories are in layers. We have what happens, we have some themes, we have other things that come in. So I sort of had an aha moment where I understood, you know, half-truths, untold stories, and how they influence people's identities. But the story is about much more. It's just that it's difficult for us to talk about it without giving away the entire plot. Those other things, the other elements that come in, the connection to nature, the issues of the environment, the issues of identity and bullying. There's bullying in the story as well. Those just come in the way that they might come in a conversation. But that's where one does more specific and purposeful work. If I have an idea about something that's happened to a character, or this character has said, well, here's my situation, then I go and do the research. Is that really plausible? Does this make sense? Because, you know, I could not have written this story had I not been the child of Caribbean Americans, had I not moved and lived in a country in the Caribbean for a while, had I not heard certain stories, had I not been a journalist and run into certain things early on. Certainly, I don't think the story would have been quite as it is, but this is not an autobiographical story. And even if you think you're talking about stuff that you know, you do need to go and check the research. And so it became more purposeful. And as I did research, sometimes a new idea came to me. You know, I hadn't set out to write about certain things, but I'd read, for example, I'd read about the working lives of immigrants from the Caribbean in the UK in a certain period, right around the late
Mhm.
60s, early 70s in specific professions, and found it interesting to learn what that experience was like. And also this sense of duality, coming back to identity. One thing that all these different, not all, but many characters have in common in Black Cake is that they have a sense of almost more than one identity or dual identity. It's not always cultural, it may be something else. But interestingly, most of these characters came to me quite comfortable with who they were. They weren't sitting there pulling their hair out over who am I, who am I supposed to be? This is who I am. I take it for granted. I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me. But then they live in the world, and the world tells you that you're not who you say you are, or the world tells you if you are who you say you are, well, you're not supposed to look this way, act this way, go into this profession, practice this sport, be with that person. And so those issues also came into the story. And I think that those are more in tune with some of the discussions we have in our contemporary lives.
Well, you render all of that really beautifully through this conversation about Black Cake and the meaningful of it and the meaningfulness of it, but also that it doesn't exist, right, without colonization. It is a meeting of two cultures and a power imbalance of those things. And so it's a beautiful thing to come out of, a thing that we are just beginning to really, we're just beginning to reckon with the full weight of that system. And I'm curious, food is such a perfect way to view the way that cultures interact with each other. And you've done that so beautifully here. You wrote in it was Elle magazine, I think, about the things in your kitchen and the recipes of your family and your both your mother and stepmother, which I thought was just really beautifully written. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about food as such a telling piece of our culture, because you have really zeroed in on it here, and it must live, it lives in all of our lives, and it obviously must live in your life through Black Cake, but I would imagine in other ways too. And I would just like to know a little bit more about what how you see culture represented in food.
Well, I think culture is represented in food in two basic ways. One is and culture isn't the right word. One is the way in which it helps us to form a sense of family or friendship or togetherness or nurturing. So that really is related to the act of preparing food, to even the act of sourcing ingredients for recipes, but that has more to do with nurturing and the human experience. Then there's the other, which is tradition. Where does the food come from? What did your parents make? What do you like to make? Now that I have moved, there are things that I like where I am, or I'll make something that is quite pedestrian to me because I'm used to it from the United States. And for example, friends in Italy will say, oh, this is great. It's so unusual. And it's not,
Right.
So the idea of food and culture is that, food in theory is sustenance. It's what we need in order to live and to be healthy. And sometimes it's just pleasure. I don't think anyone can say that Black Cake is a necessary food group, unless that's all you have to eat. But if it's all you have to eat, you wouldn't make the Black Cake. You would eat the eggs, or you would make bread with a flour.
Sure.
But the idea is that food as culture is about everything else. It's about politics, it's about economics, it's about what you have, it's about what you want to show off. The Black Cake is very important socially. In the story Black Cake, it's very important. And it is so important in terms of, just showing off and looking really good, that the people who make the Black Cake actually gain a kind of social currency for that reason. So this is where the food is fascinating to me. And when you talk about tradition, there's someone in the story Black Cake who says, whose tradition is it? And he's not talking about cake, we know that, but that's really the case. Whose tradition is it? Food is an example of how we claim traditions and we form our identities around things, but then maybe we need to take a good look at where it came from. Whose tradition is it? And if it's yours, how did it come your way? And if you love that tradition, how do you change your view of yourself when you look at the whole story? Yeah, again, the story that's not told.
Beautifully said. I know we're going to kick it over to a Q&A in a minute. I have one last question for you, which is, your book is out now. It has been optioned for Hulu by Capital Entertainment, and the only God I know who has walked among us, Oprah, for Harpo. It's a Read with Jenna pick. It's a book of the month pick. It is listed as a hotly anticipated read by more media organizations than I can list at the moment. People are loving it. So my question is, how does it feel to have your book that you have worked so hard on and put so much of your soul into and came to so organically and listened to and had this relationship with your characters? It's out into the world now. It's for everybody to read. How does it feel to be Charmaine Wilkerson this week?
Well, I would say it's mostly disorienting.
Yes, I get that.
No, really, I'm thrilled, but I think that when you never know what to expect. There are no guarantees, but I have two reactions. One, yes, it's all new, but I really go back emotionally to more than a year ago when this amazing person, my agent, Madeline Milburn, plug for my agent, contacted me and said, I like this story. I love this story and I get this story. And so that's really what it comes down to. I'm just the little girl who loved books and who always wanted to write stories, but didn't get around to it for a long time. And I think that probably everyone in this room and in the Zoom room, we love books and we like stories. So I feel grateful and privileged because there are so many wonderful writers out there who have things to say, who have stories to share. And it's a struggle. You don't know. No one sees what you're doing. You're not painting. No one can tell what you're doing. What is she doing? She's staring at her computer. She's staring into space again. Is she doing anything with her life? I think a lot of writers go through that. And so it's wonderful. But I also think that I'd like to say to other writers, there are no guarantees, but just keep writing, because the work that you do is an exploration of our lives and our cultures, and we still need to do that. Everyone is a storyteller. Not everyone sits down to write a story, but everyone is a storyteller, and we can't lose our stories. We must tell them, and if some of us are compelled to write them against all advice, well, then we have to keep doing that. I'm grateful to those who were willing to support this story and help media and book reviewers actually become aware of the story. I didn't do this alone. These are the people at Penguin Random House, at Ballantine Books, and my agent. And so, friends who write and read. And so it is a community.
Beautifully said. I just love our piece of the conversation ending on the fact that everybody is a storyteller and everybody has a story to tell. And you've told just a really beautiful one here that is transportive and moving and rich and rewards further reading. And I will say your author's note at the end, once people read the book, it's very, very fruitful. If you want to know more things about what Charmaine is writing about, read that author's note. It's just a very, very rich place to start exploring other things from. So we'll leave it to Eliana and get the audience questions. But thank you, Charmaine. This has been great.
Taylor, thank you. I'm such a fan of your writing. Malibu
Oh,
Rising is your latest book, so I have to mention that because I
thank
love
you.
the pacing and the energy and the tone.
Thank you. Well, ditto.
Thank you, Taylor and Charmaine, for this wonderful first part of the conversation. We're going to shift to some questions from the audience. We have a bunch of good ones so far. The first one is from Diane Smith, which is, how has living in Italy impacted your writing?
Well, again, I think it's part of the continuation of the fact that I've moved around a lot. I've lived on both coasts of the United States, I've lived in the Caribbean, and living in Italy definitely amplified my sort of exploration of the idea of who are you and how are you impacted by where you live? And how does your identity shift based on the people with whom you have to live? Maybe you have to speak a new language. Certainly, I'm not the first person to go through this, but I would say that that has had a huge impact. The other is it was a bit of a struggle to get back to really writing fiction, which I'd started when I was much younger, because I'm speaking in another language most of the day. And that was an interesting experience.
A question about words and language is from Donette Dunbar. Did you rely mostly on your authentic memory from your time in Jamaica for the patois and the terms such as Dundas and Duppy Conqueror and Chocho?
Duppy Conqueror. Yes, I would say so. You know, these are words that I knew when I was a child because I moved to the Caribbean when I was a little girl. And, you know, Donette mentions Jamaica. She can tell that the terms are from Jamaica, even though the island is not named in the story. It's not named for a specific reason. It's sort of to keep that location in a bit of a fog for the people who are living in the present day. But yeah, those are words I'd heard. And then I would look up like the Dundas, you know, you look up to make sure, is it what I thought it was, because I was just a child.
A question from Stephanie Wilson. I am more than halfway through this great story. To date, no specific island has been named. We know it is in the Caribbean, but not which island. Was this done to represent the experiences of the Caribbean as a collective, that is, those living in the islands, their struggles, both living there as well as their experiences as members of the diaspora living in Europe or North America?
So it's great to hear Stephanie's question, because I sort of started to touch on that, Eliana, and that is, when I was writing more about, yes, a sort of experience of a kind of place and a kind of life. And it was focused first on these two teenage girls who were very unusual. But as I went forward into the next generation, the people in the present day, I chose to keep the name out of the story, in part because the mother always talks about the islands, and also because it is a sort of a fog in the minds of the children. They don't know. And even at the end of the story, when they think they know everything, they really don't. And so that was more of a choice in terms of, first, it was the feeling of the kind of place in which these girls lived. And then later, even when I used historical detail from a specific island, because the historical details that you'll see in the book are real, I just chose to leave that name unmentioned, to kind of hold on to that feeling of that story about which we don't know everything. Only the reader knows everything.
Great. A question from Emma Gummerson. At the end of Black Cake, you shared the history behind the type it was printed in. Was there a specific reason you chose to use Fournier type?
You know, actually, that's the publisher's choice. But what is interesting is in the process, and I didn't know anything about this, is the publisher suggests a kind of a look to the print. And you can react or say, well, I like this more than the other. And I didn't even know the name. But that was sort of a vision of the great team at Penguin Random House and Ballantine Books that put together the actual print form of the book.
Wonderful. A question from Michael. Thank you for your wonderful novel. I thought a lot about the character of Marble. How will she reconcile between her two families? And what did you imagine occurred in the unseen confrontation with her British parents?
So I want to avoid throwing out too many spoilers, so I won't say too much about Marble. But without a doubt, Marble has been living for a number of years with an internal conflict. She knows in her heart that her parents have not told her the truth. This is another family now. So I've talked about Byron and Benny, the brother and sister who are the children of Eleanor. Marble is a British woman who is convinced that her parents have not told her the truth. But every time she tries to get them to do so, they just act as though nothing's happened. And she kind of decides to live with that because she's not really sure. I think I've forgotten the second half of Michael's question, but that's what I imagine in the scene is that her parents finally have to sit down and tell her, because when she walks in that door, they know that she knows, even if she doesn't know the real story. They know, you know, the game is up. They have to explain what's happened.
Thank you. A question from Melrose. Did you have any role in designing the cover? What was the cover design process like? And was there any specific thinking behind the very different US versus UK covers?
There was a thinking process. You know, there was kind of a conversation among the two publishers actually about the kinds of things they wanted to highlight. And then they came up with different designs. And so in the case of the US book, which has just come out yesterday, the designer Jaya Miseli really came up with the core design for the cover. Do I have a copy of the book here? I mean, everyone's seen it probably. I'll grab it from the table. I have this conveniently located nearby. And so this cover, for example, if you look, it looks as though the bands, they may look as though they relate to water. That was the idea. And there was a conversation of, here's what we're thinking. What do you think? And I know that for me personally, it's the food and the water. It's the food and the water, because both of those things, both of those aspects in characters' lives represent something visceral. In the book, there are characters who have visceral connections to the sea and visceral connections to the black cake and the food in terms of the preparation. You know, again, the act of preparing food, of mixing ingredients, of adding precision to the process and being together. So these are two very strong currents in the story. And I think that this cover, for example, represents the water and the layers in the story.
Wonderful. Our final question from Anthony is, what is your favorite novel of all time? To finish this off.
Oh, you can't ask me that question. But
how about, or
no,
either that or what's a novel you've read that you've loved recently? Whichever you feel like answering.
No, that's fine, Eliana. I was actually going to name two novels that I love. One that I feel is very close to the kind of story that Black Cake is, but written differently. And the other just because it opened my mind as to a different way of telling a story. One is The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan, about the mothers and the daughters. You may recall that. And there's a story of secrets in the past as well. And the younger generation has to learn what the parents went through. And Toni Morrison's Beloved. Toni Morrison's Beloved, I read that when it first came out. I was a very young adult. And it was a revelation to me because I have read many books that I've loved, but this story used language that was contemporary. It was writing about the past, about a woman who has escaped slavery. So that gives you an idea of the time period and the trauma she's gone through. But the language had a rhythm and a daring that to me meant contemporary fiction. And that's what I love about what's being written now. You know, each one of us has a voice, each one of us has a different way to tell a story. And often we're telling the same story, but we're approaching it with different language, different energy. And that is what I love about contemporary fiction and literature as it is written every day, the new books that come out. There's always a revelation in something I read now, and it's really a joy. I mean, it's why we read books, I think.
Wonderful. What a great way to end this great conversation. Thank you so much, Charmaine. Thank you so much, Taylor. Thank you so much to our friends at BCLF. To everyone watching, if you haven't gotten Black Cake yet, go buy it right now from the Center for Fiction online, or come to our bookstore in Brooklyn. And thank you everyone for being here, and have a wonderful night.